5 seconds to submergence. Submergence deep into the absurd.
Alright, we got Bryce back on Into the Absurd. And I'm going to share a little quote from The Will to Power because it kind of relates to belief and reality epistemology, something that Bryce teaches at the university. The belief that the world as it ought to be really exists, is the belief of the unproductive who do not desire to create a world as it ought to be. They posit it as already available. They seek ways and means of reaching it. Will to truth as the impotence of the will to create.
Great. Can you read it one more time, Greg?
Yes, I can read it one more time.
Also, thanks for having me back. It's nice to be doing it again.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So essentially, what's going on here is that Nietzsche is saying that philosophers, they often want a world of truth, right? Mm-hmm. And that implies that this world is untruth, right? But it also implies that they're seeking this world that is elsewhere, right? They say, well, where is this world? Where is it? But it's right here, right? Because all you have to do is to create the world that you want,
right? And I got that from the quote, and I think that there is the deeper underpinnings of Nietzsche's critique here, especially as it relates to like organized religion and a more deterministic view of reality, right? Where it's like, if there's a God, then God has created the world and God has planned the world to be a certain way, and so that's all we need to be caring about, right? And like follow along with what is in the world already. Where Nietzsche, has high-level critiques of any sort of organized religion and Christianity, especially. But the way that I think he thinks that obviously Christianity and other organized religions keep the world as it is, right? And kind of like what that quote references, where it tells people not to change, not to consider something other than what we have. And it also maybe perhaps limits creativity. I'm going to the very end of the quote. And I forget where this quote is from, but one of my favorite kind of points of Nietzsche is what he thinks is strongest and most alive is that which is most creative, right? And the fact that there is something unique to human beings, and especially within the existentialist program of especially the more atheistic existentialist program, where there is this focus on self, this focus on again, us being in greater possession of ourself and should be in greater possession of ourself to create a world that maybe is other than it is already, right? And in the way that is one really challenging, because how do you change the world? How do you change the systems that we're in? How do you change the society that we, behave and partake daily in, right? And I think that Nietzsche for sure was interested in that, but I think he has the underpinning that's the deeper level of what is one's frame and consciousness as one relates to reality, relates to one's own existence, right? And does one, again, just kind of placate and say, yep, this is how things are. Okay, God, tell me how to live. Or does one take possession of oneself and really start to make choices to live for oneself, in a world with others, but also recognizing that we actually might be capable of more than what we think we are, right? At least that's just I'm rolling off that quote a little bit. But I think that works, right? And especially when we think of epistemologically speaking, to what extent are we able to think about, again, this kind of level of determinism, of indeterminism, and what kind of space in that kind of classification can we, move forward with too. But
Yeah, and he heavily negates determinism. He kind of negates the whole concept of causality in general.
Right.
That well, we're saying that when an event leads to another event, we're saying that X led to X, right? And we're kind of ignoring all the other things around it that led before that. So, and also we're saying that with causality, there was this point where there was a beginning, where that thing in itself wasn't a cause of something else, right? Because everything is a cause of something before it, and if time goes forever, then, where's the start, right?
Great.
Where was the first cause?
Classic metaphysical question, classic theological question, right? Because again, often theological responses are like, well, God's the creator of everything. Well, what created God? Can something be the creation of itself? And those are issues that, I think are fascinating to think about. I'm not all too concerned about it because it's like, well, we're here, right?
Yeah.
Excuse me. But I think that they are, interesting to consider, especially in that metaphysical space. But then I also think that what you're speaking to, again, falls deeply in line with various existential themes, and most importantly, I think what you just described is the absurd, frankly. And just to the title of your podcast, Into the Absurd, that's what we're diving into, right? And to take it a step further, existentially speaking, that's what we're diving into with our existence, is the absurd, because nobody has the answer, right? And even those that might want to point to a religious outlook and might be very convinced by a religious outlook, there are still some insufficiencies in trying to explain existence, right? And trying to explain why we're here, why we're doing what we're doing, and how it is we ought to live. And frankly, the existentialist says, all right, these are worthwhile questions, but also they're freaking absurd. We're here, we need to know what to do about it, right? And just that there isn't, and again, for especially Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus, there's this reference that there is no deity, there is no predestined, determined way of thinking about our own existence, but rather we have to reconcile what to do, perhaps in a quote-unquote, I'm going to maybe kick myself saying this, but we have to reconcile what to do in a quote-unquote meaningless world, right? And I'm doing air quotes around meaningless because for Camus, Sartre, and Nietzsche, there still is meaning. It's just not from a higher power, right?
Yes. It comes from within.
Exactly. And so the idea, I think, that's really provocative here is that and this I think actually goes to your quote that you started out with. So many want to point to this quote-unquote objective, meaning that exists for reality, for existence, but various existentialists are saying, nope, that doesn't, right? But we can still create meaning, we can still exist in a meaningful way, but that's through our choices, it's through the world within which we create, it's through, what we choose to engage with and how we choose to engage with it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you have the free will to determine your own meaning,
right?
To have a meaningful existence. And that's kind of why I brought up that causality thing, right? Because if there's no causes, then you are responsible for everything.
Right. And that, for many, seems freaking terrifying.
Yes.
Right? And I would say more so than Nietzsche, but this is something that Sartre points to, which I feel very compelled by. I feel very compelled by Sartre's recognition of this inescapable responsibility, where, again, I think it's freaking scary, but I also think that it allows one to take greater possession of oneself and kind of the existence that one has and one hopes to have, right? And so the question is, what do we do with that responsibility, right? Do we embrace it? Do we try to take it on? Or do we run away from it and say, nope, not my responsibility. God's going to tell me how to live. Look at all these systems that are already in place. I can't go do anything and be anyone I want to be because I just can't do that. Like, that's impossible, right? Or, so I mean, it's like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, it's a whole labyrinth of philosophical thought, right? And sometimes you get trapped in this one little area of the labyrinth and you just think, you know what, I'm just going to stay here.
Yeah.
And some people, they say, nope, I'm turning back. I'm going to keep trying to find that treasure in the center of wherever it is.
Right.
When I personally believe that there's no real treasure, right?
Right.
We're just, the labyrinth in itself is the treasure.
Right. And then again, I think you're right to point out in that kind of metaphor where it's like, what do you do within that labyrinth, right? And I mean, I think the easy critique, and maybe I'll catch some flack for saying this, but also, why the hell not? But I feel like that corner in the labyrinth of people saying, all right, I know that this like labyrinth exists, but I'm just going to stop here and settle, right? Like, I mean, that's very much, I would say, in line with the kind of like stereotypical cookie cutter, kind of life, right? Where it's like, all right, you buy a house at the end of a cul-de-sac, you have 2.5 kids, you've got a nice little fence, you work a little bit, you have 2 cars, maybe you own a boat, and what? You do that for 30 years, 40 years, and then you die, and then your children repeat that cycle. Like, is that really like the best way to live? Is just to kind of like find that, and again, like, and I'm not trying to like be belittling in any capacity, because like, I think that there's a lot of people that are very proud of the life that they can create for themselves that maybe mimic that kind of outlook. But my main point in saying that is, I mean, I think that at various points, and I feel very confident about this, that we have all gone and all go through quote-unquote existential crises at various stages in our lives, right? And those can be provoked by experiences, by situations, and I think that there are those that, like those situations that you're confronted again, maybe to work in that labyrinth, right? And I mean, the classic, Robert Frost poem of like, 2 roads diverge in a wood, right? And which one do you take? Like, there's the easy one, and then there's the one that's more of the unknown, right? And like, and the unknown might, down the line reap greater reward, but taking that first step is the most difficult thing to do, right? Because like, the path that's easy is just that, it's easy, right? Like, you know what you're going to get, you know that you're going to live securely, both financially, probably like in a location that's secure, you're going to be able to raise your children in a way that's healthy, which is great. And I'm not, again, trying to denigrate that at all, because I think that
we're the products of that.
Exactly. Yes, 100%. We're very lucky to be products of that, right? And I feel very grateful to come from a loving family that had the resources to provide good education, provide great opportunity. But I also think that it's interesting, and I know to my parents, I don't know if it's frustration, but probably to my parents, I don't even think it's confusion, but to my parents, probably just like questioning how I'm 33, I'm not married, I don't have a house, I don't have kids, I don't live at the end of a cul-de-sac, right? Like so in what way, like, in what way have I done something wrong, quotations around it. And especially when like many of my friends that are the same age, do own a house, do have kids, do live in the burbs, like, and all of those changes within their lives have occurred in the last 3 to 5 years, right? And so it's just kind of interesting to see like how we all kind of like take in and take on various ways of thinking about living our lives. And I would claim like, and again, I want to be very sensitive here that like, I don't think anybody's doing it better or worse than anybody else. Like, I don't think that I've made better decisions than my friends that have gotten married, had kids, lived at the end of a cul-de-sac. Like, we're just living different lives. But it's like, what versions of those lives, and where did those conceptions of what counts as a meaningful existence, like, where did that come from? Or kind of in what way do we, what way do we embrace possibilities that embrace possibilities or not embrace possibilities? I mean, sorry, I'm going to roll for a second. Is that okay?
Oh, keep rolling.
Okay, all right.
Roll on.
This is a little bit more personal than maybe philosophical, but like, I personally have like, moments where, I've now been teaching for about 10 years, lived in the same town for about 10 years. I've had friends from graduate school here at the University of Idaho that have all moved on to like other places and done other things. And often there's this view, societally speaking, that like moving on means progression, right? Like, you're moving to something new, you're moving to something else. And like, sometimes it's phrased like you're moving to something better, right? And I've had a handful of friends that I've known that move, and they like really struggle for community, for people. They struggle for, finding like kind of a lifestyle that they were able to have here, or that they would be more preferential to. And so I struggled for a long time of being like one that didn't move, that stayed here, that, I teach the same damn classes most semester. I've got some variability. And so in what way have like I played it safe, right? Like, in what way, like, when I'm confronted with, possibilities of, staying on the same path of living in Moscow, being an instructor at the University of Idaho, teaching philosophy, like, that's the easy path because that's what I know. But then, like, to what extent, when opportunities come about to like maybe pursue elsewhere, do other things, like, frankly, for a long time, I've never even entertained them, right? And so existentially, I kind of grapple with the same critique that I offered a couple of minutes ago, where it's like, all right, I may not be married, have kids, live in the burbs, but I haven't changed a ton about my existence, right? And that is something that like I think about, and I don't have a good response to, other than I think one thing, and again, this is maybe my cynicism, but one thing that I know that I can point to is that luckily, with the career that I have as a teacher, I feel very passionate about it. And like, and because of like actually being excited to teach, to be in the classroom, to like continue to like maintain and be lucky to maintain this job, it makes not taking on other risks easier, right? Yeah. Where I know many, and again, I think, stupid phrase, but different strokes for different folks. Like, but I don't think I would do well in a corporate setting. Right? Yes. Like, I don't think that environment, I don't think that particular lifestyle, even though if I probably worked in some corporate job for some agency doing something, probably make like double what I make, like, which is kind of a funny thing. But I don't know if I would necessarily feel as fulfilled as I feel. So
well, I mean, the cost of living in some other place is going to be vastly more expensive than here anyways. So it's not like you'd have more money.
Right, exactly. Like in the relative kind of scheme of it, right? And so, but it's been interesting just to kind of connect it with, with where I'm at as someone in my early 30s, and looking around at others that are my friends that I've known for a while in their early 30s, and like, what kind of lives are we living, right? And then grappling like existentially with all sorts of things, and I think this past year, like being in the COVID world, and like kind of like having more time actually like away from the classroom, I mean, I missed it for sure, but I also like had more time to think about like what could be next, right? Like what could I find myself doing, what I could find myself doing maybe like that wouldn't be in Idaho, that wouldn't be teaching, right? And I've got some options, but like I also think, and I'm going to tie it a different direction. Sorry, this cup of coffee is kicking in, so I'm
Yeah.
I'm rolling here.
Try to roll on.
Yeah, all right. But I think that there's also something really interesting, which we can kind of steer it back maybe a little bit more to like a cerebral kind of intellectual discussion, or we can just kind of keep diving, whatever. But I don't think that our existence is defined by our profession. And I think that societally speaking, especially in the West, especially in America, we make this move that we define ourselves by what it is we do, aka we define ourselves by how it is we make money, which I think is an issue. And I think that I struggle with that. I think a lot of people struggle with that. And I think, and Sartre had a lot to say about this. And Nietzsche, Sartre had a lot to say about like kind of this concept that I'm speaking to right now, where it's like, when I think of like other existential possibilities, often I think of them in terms of, well, I need to make money, right? Or like, how will I make money? Or, what could I see myself doing? Also known as like, what job could I see myself having? And I think that's an issue. The way that like, I think that's an issue, and I don't know how to combat it. I mean, Sartre wants to definitely like make sure that like we don't play roles, right? Like, so when we think of like how to define our existence, we shouldn't just reduce it to the roles that we play. And Sartre also had various thoughts on the capitalistic structure and the way that like capitalism, and this is in line with various like Marxist ideas of thought, but like the
You get alienated from yourself.
Yes, absolutely, and the working force is a necessity that doesn't actually exist, right? But maybe it does exist, right? And that's the question. Like I mean, and so that's where it's tricky.
Well, it's a psychological thing.
Right.
I mean, it exists psychologically. Like people create a need for something that was never a need before so that they can make money.
Right.
Right? Oh, you need this. Right? You need it. I swear you need it.
Right.
Oh, and you need to create this thing that these people need so that I can make money from your labor.
Right. And in that process, and I think you're right to point out that like you lose track of who it is you are often, right? Like, and you wrap yourself up into an identity that isn't maybe of who you are, but it's of what your product is, right? Whatever that product be, right? Like maybe a material object, maybe an immaterial object, right?
But this is also, I mean, there's another way to take this. It's, sure, like you might be slaving away for someone, but in a sense, we all have the opportunity to create something, right? And with that creation, we can survive off of what we create.
Right.
It's an economy that thrives off of people being creative, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, one thing that is of value to it. And we can think of it in the way like, oh, I have to go work for this person. I take all my value from being a plumber, right? I take all my value from being a plumber. When I'm not a plumber, I feel like my life is meaningless, blah, blah, blah. But you could also think of it, oh, I have a meaningful job, and I have a meaningful life outside of that job, and my job provides me with what I need to survive. And with that, I also use the little leftovers to do whatever.
Right.
Right.
Right. And I think that is the more helpful way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is a nice response of like, of again, hopefully finding passion and worth in the work that one does. And again, I want to be very like clear. I am freaking lucky. Like I get to, I'm very privileged to be able to be a senior instructor in philosophy at a major institution in the United States of America. And like, I get to, I'm very, very lucky. And like, and that's not lost on me. And it's not lost that I have a lot more kind of like autonomy than maybe others in other professions do, right? Where there's much more of a strict set of guidelines of what has to be done, when it has to be done, et cetera, right? And I think that autonomy, and I've had conversations with friends and partners that are similar to this, where it's like, one thing that I love about my job isn't like, I mean, I love teaching philosophy, but I love the lifestyle that it affords, right? And I feel like I have more time to devote to other things that are important to me than maybe I wouldn't if I had a different profession. And this ties into an observation that Marx makes about, you know, when we are most alive is when we're at play, right? Like that's kind of like how he, to my understanding, it's been a long time since I've like actually read and engaged with Marx, but like he was highly aware of how much leisure plays into how we like know ourselves and think of ourselves, and like and so, you know, in this kind of capitalistic world within which we live, those moments that we are most free are those moments when we're at leisure, right? Because we're doing whatever we want. And so we make this move. We're like, all right, well, I worked, 40 hours this week, so I've got the weekend off. I'm going to do whatever I want. And then I got to go back to Monday and do it all over again, right? Where like, what would it look like if we, like, the normalized 40-hour work week was reduced by 8 hours, right? Or
we could
like,
definitely reduce it.
Right.
I mean, there's no need to be working 40 hours a week, at least in my opinion.
Right. And then, like, what might that do for overall, one, just general productivity, and two, for the way people think of themselves and think of kind of like how they spend their time. And this isn't also to say, because I think you kind of mentioned this. I mean, I also like to work. Like I like, and I've like grappled with this thought where, and I think I mentioned this maybe in the last podcast we did, but like I bartend part-time, right? Mm-hmm. And the place where I bartend just reopened in late March. And the past couple of weeks, I've been on campus like during the day, and I like kind of wrap up my work here on campus at like 2, and then I usually get to the bar 3-4 nights a week at like 3:30, and I open the bar and I stay there till like 9 or 10. And so there's been some long days over the last 4 to 6 weeks, but it's been really good too. Like I like it, and I like those two outlets. And again, like sometimes the way that and the way that I've like kind of like thought more about work is more so not about necessarily money. I mean, it's not to say that I don't think about money, because I absolutely do. But I think about it in terms of time, right? And I think about it in terms of like time and energy. And I think that, again, I'm in a very privileged spot to be able to be like, all right, if either job wasn't worth my time or energy, then I should pursue something else that would be worth my time and energy. Right?
Yeah, that's the thing. You have the freedom to choose where you work, and you have the responsibility to choose where you work. Right?
Exactly. And again, I think this is easier said than done. I'm not, and I think I'm coming from like, again, a really lucky perspective, because I enjoy both teaching philosophy and I enjoy bartending. And I'm in a position that feels very, it just feels very lucky. And where like I know many people that are in positions that are perhaps quite unhappy, and maybe don't seem like there's a total way to get out of it. And the prospect of like getting out of it seems even more daunting than staying in it, right? And so that's why I think a lot of people stay in really hard, really frustrating jobs, and I think you can extrapolate this to like relationships as well, because like sometimes the ideologies, it's like easier to stay in than, going back to what we were saying, take that path of the unknown, right? And either quit the job or break up with that person, and then you're left in this space that's very vulnerable. It's very scary because it's not what you know.
Yeah, but I mean, no matter what, you're gonna die. So,
That,
I mean,
that is a fact. Right. Yes.
so it's
Right.
it's not like even if you were like out on the street starving, like that's gonna happen at some time anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really think it should be. I mean, it's a worry for me, obviously.
Right.
Like I am scared of like, oh God, like losing everything and then starving on the street. But then I kind of take a step back. Hey, well, that's gonna happen anyways. There's gonna be a time when I'm gonna be sick, or I'm gonna get hit by a car, I'm gonna get shot, I'm gonna get stabbed, I'm gonna fall over, hit my back, lay
Right.
unconscious. I'm gonna find a brain tumor in my head. I'm
Hey.
gonna find a tumor in my lungs. Blah 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 blah. I'm going to be inexistent at some time,
Right.
or I'm gonna go off to some other realm outside of this life.
Right.
This life in particular is going to end, and you can't escape that reality.
Right. And so then that ties back into something we started out with, like, how do you live in the face of that? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, yeah, I think two things. One, I mean, it speaks, I think, to the fragileness of existence. You know, where again, like, yeah, like anything can happen, right?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, obviously we live our lives often, like, you know, by assessing risk, right? And what is risky, what is not risky, and again, risk being like, you know, all right, we're on like the third floor here, like, you know, are we at more risk being up high for, I don't know, a tree branch coming through the window, or like, you know, would it have been less risky to like do this interview on a first floor, right? Like
Yeah.
but again, those aren't really thoughts that we think too consciously, right? But yeah, so I think we make a lot of decisions about kind of like how we think we will best continue to live, survive, and maybe that's instinctual to some capacity. But then I also think your comment speaks to, again, what both Sartre, Nietzsche, and others recognize, which again is the absurdity of existence, right? Like I think that we make, and we should make, and I do think this, I think we should make a lot of meaning out of the existence that we have at present, but it's also making that meaning in the face and the recognition that it could be over like that, right? Like, and so again, like, how do you operate with that prospect? Do you say, fuck it, I'm out, right? Like, it could be over at any instant. Or do you say, well, this is what I got, and I'm going to make X, Y, Z decision, you know?
Have you read The Conspiracy Against the Human Race?
No, I've never even heard of it.
It's definitely something that you should consider throwing in belief in reality.
Okay.
It's sort of a horror fiction. I just read the preface so
Okay.
far this morning, and it's kind of a lot like Nausea. I haven't read Nausea.
Okay.
I've just read the synopsis. But he was telling this story about when he was a little kid, like 9 years old. His parents were yelling at him, and then he walks outside, and his friends were waiting, and then his friends were like, what went on? How's it going? And then his friend said, or like the guy says, yeah, like screw them, like I hate my parents or whatever. And his friends say, well, don't say that. That's horrible. Your parents created you. You're the reason why you exist. I mean, they're the reason why you exist. And then the guy, he starts thinking to himself, like, why should I be grateful for something I didn't, cause, that I had no say in? I had no say in existing. And who am I to say if this existence is any good?
Right.
Who am I to say that this existence is something special? That having brought out from inexistence into existence, that this is some good thing, that this isn't something that's, say, like nauseating, like Sartre would say.
Right. Good. Very curious about that book, so you have to let me know how it is.
Yeah, I will.
And two, yeah, just in that little anecdote, I mean, yeah, it very much seems and sounds in relationship to kind of this notion of the absurd, right? And that we've mentioned a couple of times, but yeah, this idea that like we didn't choose to be born. Like it's a very strange thought to think, because we're here, right? we were born to who we were born to. And like you and I can sit down and like have this chat and connect, but we've also had like very different lives, right? Like you were raised in Idaho, I was raised in Kansas. We're both, in the United States, but like how come, and again, like, was it just chance? Like could I have been born in Malaysia, right? But would it have been me that was born in Malaysia, or would it have been Malaysian being, not me, right? Like you can play these like really like weird games, but it is like this very, I mean, and again, not to denigrate like in any capacity, like but it seems all arbitrary, right? Especially,
I think so.
Especially if you're not. And again, this is in line with like a Sartrean way of thinking about it, where especially if like you don't hold to a religious outlook and you don't think that God had a plan for you, if you don't think that God planned on you being born to the parents that you were born to, and that God planned your parents getting together, that God planned their parents having them, right? Like, and you again trace this like reductive line all the way back, right? Like if you take a lot of that out of the equation, then yeah, like a lot of it seems pretty damn arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, going back to the causality thing, I mean, if God planned all that, well, who planned God?
Right.
Right.
And then again, you kind of ask those questions about like, okay, well, I grew up in a really great part of Kansas City to really great parents that I'm very lucky for. But what about those that are raised by a single parent in the inner city that maybe really do have a much more difficult life than I do, right? And that have had a much more difficult life than I could even frankly probably imagine. And it's like, did I just get lucky, right? Like, I mean, did I just get lucky? And then what does that mean for me moving forward, especially if and when I, am potentially a father? Like, and that's, again, not to say that, like, I think that we can all say, like, yeah, we can work hard and try to provide the best for our children and provide the best for, like, our future generations. But, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting thought where it's like, and then you play out the game, okay, well, like, I was lucky enough to be born to who I was born to, but, like, in what way would my life had been different had my parents been millionaires, right? Or like, I don't know, you can play these games, you can play all these what ifs across the board, and I don't know how productive it all is other than to point to some of the insights that Sartre and Nietzsche offer, where it's like a lot of this is arbitrary, even though we think it's like preordained or really like destined, but a lot of it's arbitrary. And then second, what do we do about it? Right? Like, I mean, I think that's like the question that I think is maybe more worthwhile to ask is like, all right, we can play all these what ifs and offshoots of all these questions, but like, now what? Like I'm here, I'm having this conversation with you. I'm lucky to be part of the family that I'm part of. I have the relationships that I do with my friends, my partner. Like, now what? Like ready, set, go from here rather than like all of that behind me, right? Which is definitely like part of who it is I am at present, but it's also not, but that also, like, yeah, like we if we think time is real, and if we think that and if we think that we should do something about the fragileness of our own existence, then we should live. We should not just settle, right?
Yeah. And I think, with time, if you thought about it, we think of time in seconds. But if we were to split each second to infinitely small fractions, right, it would all just be fluid, basically. So with that said, each moment doesn't really lead to the next because there's no real moments. It's all just there.
Right. It's all just there, and it's all like, it's this kind of like paradoxical approach of it being an illusion, but it being a constant as well.
Yeah.
Right. And and how do you reconcile that? Yeah, I had an interesting discussion in my Belief in Reality class this semester, where we were talking about identity, and and asking this kind of question of like, how am I the same person as I was when I was 5, when I was 15? Like, in what way can my identity always be changing, but always be constant, right? Like, because I think that there is this hope of a reconciliation between constant change and permanence. And I had a student that brought up something that I had never even considered, but I thought it was like rather telling. And they brought up this idea of and they were talking about like when you learn a skill, right? If that skill still exists now, then you can be mildly confident that it was you who learned that skill years prior, right? And so I was thinking about this, right? Where it's like, me as 33-year-old Bryce, probably couldn't play guitar if 16-year-old Bryce didn't start learning how to play guitar, right? And so there's this interesting like move of like, and I don't remember much about what my life was like when I was 16. It's crazy to think that was like 16, 17 years ago. It makes me feel real old. But I do know that there is some sort of consistency because, again, I can possess the same skill that a prior self started learning, right? And so, kind of like thinking about it like existentially, like, okay, what kind of things can we do now that can, again, build our own identities in the future, but also like maybe even build more of our existences in the future that are ours, right? In that kind of like possessive sense that I think is like deeply existential.
The way I think of it is that I kind of just feel like an experiencer. That's my role in existence, is being an experiencer. And everything else, the thoughts that come in my head, the words that come out of my mouth, the decisions that quote unquote I make, these are just things that I guess quote unquote I experience, right? That this thing that's experiencing reality is experiencing. Because when we go back to that skill analogy of you learning guitar when you were 16 years old, and now you know how to play guitar, right? But the thing is, when you're born, and if you throw a baby into a pool, they already know how to swim. They start swimming. It's the only primate that knows how to swim straight from birth. But that's a skill, isn't it? But you didn't learn the skill. Right. Your ancestors did. Right. But they weren't you, were they?
Right.
They were something totally different.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, you kind of like start to work in, I mean, these kind of questions, I think, are not only like metaphysical, but they are like, there's an area of philosophy called the philosophy of biology, right? Which asks these like kind of like more, I would say obviously like deeper questions that a lot of like biology just assumes, right? And so we think about like those questions, and I mean I do not feel qualified to actually like dive into it, so I'm gonna reel back here.
That's right.
I took a philosophy of biology class in graduate school. Yeah, and I remember like being obviously like kind of into it, but I would not be qualified to speak.
Well, let's just keep in mind, this isn't an education podcast, right? This is an entertainment podcast. Right. So, I mean, you don't have to be qualified to say something about something, right?
Right. Whew, close one. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is something like, okay, I'm going to go a different direction, but it connects with the analogy, right? More classically and more easily engaged with is the question as it relates to our identity, both perhaps metaphysically and existentially. What shapes us, nature or nurture, right? And I mean, like, that's a classic question in psychology. It's a classic question in philosophy and sociology, right? And like, into what extent does one play more of a role than the other? Are they equal, right? and I think that that's a really like fascinating question to ask, because like I absolutely am a product of where I was raised, who I was raised by, the opportunities that were afforded to me, and then currently the life that I still am lucky to live, right? Like absolutely, like the nurture around me has absolutely shaped who it is that I am. But I also know that like my the genetics that I've been predisposed to, the familial history, both like in my actual family, but then also, you think of it like just in terms of like the human family, right? Like it's kind of a challenging question. It's interesting, right? I mean, and I think that many would often try to say, I think the easy answer is like it's a little bit of both. I think that's like the safe answer. But like, what might be more, right? Like, and to the fact that like, and what the implications would be were it to be found out that like nature plays a lot more of a role than nurture, right? And then how much of like an inescapability of like our physiological genetic selves that we can't escape, right? Like if I have, if my family has a history of, some sort of disease, like to what extent, like I can't escape that. Like that's just part of my genetics. And again, going back to like something we talked about, it'd be kind of like in line with that focus on the arbitrariness of just like, well, shit, yep. Like, I mean, I don't, just as an example, I mean, I don't have, you think of whatever kind of like genetic diseases that maybe get passed down, and if it makes you a higher percentage chance of developing that disease later on, or yada yada yada, like doesn't that just seem kind of arbitrary to like you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's arbitrary.
Yeah.
Because I mean, everything in nature outside of us that nurtures us, I mean, they have properties that were natured and nurtured into them. If you have a history of heart failure in your family, there was a time, generations before you, where that was nurtured into them, right? Through whatever happened in their environment, that caused their genes to shift in such a way where it would lead to heart failure down the line.
Right. And what's more, and again, this isn't to like denote that we shouldn't not take our health seriously, because we absolutely should. But you could be the most healthy person and like, exercise regularly, eat well, make really conscientious decisions about like your physical health and your internal health as well. But shit, you still might get heart disease.
Yeah.
Right? Like again, this goes back to something we were saying where it's like you could reduce the risk, right? And you hear that phrasing all the time, right? It reduces your risk of heart. It reduces your risk of heart failure. It reduces your risk of lung disease, yada yada yada. Like you hear that phrase, even in advertising, you hear that phrase all the time, lowering the risk. But even if like you still lower the risk, just in the virtue of being a damn human being, puts you at risk for developing some of this shit, right? So it's like, so again, you can go through all and make all of the quote unquote right decisions, and then you still find out perfect, healthy 33, 34-year-old female develops heart disease and dies within a year, right? And so what's the narrative that often surrounds that? Like, oh, I mean, shit, it is so sad. I'm not trying to be like dismissive of that, but it's like, but it is so sad, but it's like.
It's sad to live in general.
Right. And it's like, okay. And I think that it just further reinforces the nature of the absurd. And I mean, you hear this kind of like, and I know I want to be sensitive here, but you sometimes hear this response where it's like, well, right, if God has a plan, if there is a God, and if God has a plan, right, God will, when one door closes, another door opens, right? You hear this kind of like imagery surrounding like paths and direction. And I feel like it's a really troubling response where it's like, okay, going back to this example of a 34-year-old woman dying of heart disease who was, by all measure really healthy, right? It's like, I personally find it really difficult for someone to offer me a religious explanation to what God's plan was with that woman's life, right? Like,
well, it's for us to talk about on this podcast.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And because in the more general way of saying this, which is not a new problem for religion, but it's also not a new problem just for like existence. But right, why do bad things happen to good people? You hear that question all the time. Or like, if God is all knowing, if God is all powerful, then why doesn't God help stop the hunger crisis?
Well, why would he care
Exactly.
if he's all powerful and all knowing?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that just
Right.
yeah, but I think that there is this like this move that's like really difficult, and you hear like, well, God wants you to, God puts you through tribulations and trials for you to come out stronger on the other side. And I think that's a noble outlook to an extent, but I also think that it's pretty dismissive of like how hard shit can actually be sometimes, and how like frankly inexplainable so much hard stuff can be sometimes, right? And I feel like this grasping, like I feel like this is safe to talk about, but it's like
It's safe.
Yeah.
This is a safe zone.
All right. I was just chatting with my mom a couple of weeks ago, and we had a family friend that I think in her late 20s, early 30s, and she had become unresponsive and was and again she's a fit woman, she's healthy. She is married. She has, I think, one kid, like a 2 or 3 year old, and her dad found her at her house on the floor, kind of convulsing and like unresponsive, and took her to the hospital, and it seemed like everything was like just like shutting down. And come to find out, this person had been bitten by a tick and was suffering some
like seizures
and responses from Lyme disease.
Wow.
And in my conversation with my mother, I mean, I was just like, again, just like kind of blown away. I mean, one, in caring for the person that I know that was experiencing this, right? Like I can like have and try to be like, oh my gosh, that is just so freaking sad, so scary, right?
Yeah.
And then second, like thinking about like, again, this like arbitrary nature of existence, which goes back to the fragileness of like this tiny little insect, right? That's smaller than the damn, head of your pin. Like,
I mean, he was just trying to eat.
Right. And nearly, and causes the like, I don't know. It's really tough to reconcile. And it's like, and so for me, and I'm all for people doing what they need to do to find comfort, to find a path to move forward, to heal, right? But it's like, okay, offer up prayers for this person, but it's also, aren't we praying to the same God that allowed this to happen?
Yeah.
And like that either and allowed, and what I mean by allowed is like didn't intervene from it not happening. Yeah. Right? And I guess maybe a response would be like, well, they had free will to go camping, or they had free will to do X, Y, and Z, or like the world's a dangerous place, yada, yada, yada. But it's still like, I think that there's a tension, and I struggle with like what I take to be an incompatibility of saying, well, let's pray for healing and health and all of these things, when in fact, like, if God wanted to, wouldn't God just like help us all out?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's you can only put so much in of what you take out, right? it has to all balance.
Right.
Has to all be equal.
Right.
So even if you were to pray to stop world hunger, there'd be something else that would be taken away from that, right? That's the deal with the devil that we
Right.
take,
Right.
right? You can have this awesome life that's amazing, and you have beautiful friends and a beautiful life, and you got to go camping on the weekends, but one day.
Right. Right.
So.
Yeah. I think, it's been interesting while we're teetering around this edge. It's been interesting this past year in the pandemic. And I think because in the pandemic, I don't know about you, but I think that I've definitely consumed more media than I probably would have liked. Just with like more free time, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And both that be social media and just like in general paying more attention to the news. And I mean, it's been a pretty intense year for a lot of different reasons. But like, I've also, I have a religious background. I don't know if I mentioned that in the previous.
You've
podcast.
told me that before.
Yeah. So I have a religious background. So a lot of these questions are, and a lot of like my comments are more developed now as a 33-year-old than certainly when I was like a pretty evangelical Christian when I was 18, right? Like, I would hear these questions, but I was pretty convinced by some of the evangelical religious responses that I would get and how to address them. Mm-hmm. But I always still felt that there was like more to question and more to like be like, like I've always had this kind of like, I don't know about that kind of attitude.
Yeah, like, wait a minute.
What's that?
It's like, wait a minute.
Exactly, yeah. And it's been interesting, even though like I don't profess to be a Christian, obviously, clearly. I mean, that should be pretty clear in this podcast. And nor do I adhere to like an organized religion. I mean, I think that there's still a beauty in thinking about the metaphysics of a deity or an energy, because that's so new agey, that does like kind of connect all of us in some capacity. But I say all that by way of saying this past year, I've been really interested, and this stems from a lot of the political divides that I don't really want to dive into on the podcast.
Yeah.
But a lot of the political divides that I feel like have seen even more so in the past year and a half. But it's made me really interested in revisiting as it relates to like I've revisited the New Testament because I've been curious about it, right? Mm-hmm. I've been curious to be like for the lack of a phrase of sounding corny, what would Jesus do in 2020, 2021?
Yeah.
Right? And in a way, by kind of revisiting some of like these texts, I mean, I still have various like issues with a lot of underpinnings, but
I mean, it's all Paul, really.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like it's been really, all I'm going to say is it's been really like, I think worthwhile to revisit. And I think that I think there is obviously a lot of lesson and a lot of, I think, humility that could and should be learned from what we know to have been Jesus' life. Now, whether or not Jesus was the Son of God, that's going to, again, be for theology and, like, other people to wrestle with, to, grapple with. Like, I don't necessarily want to, like, dive into that. But I just think, like, as a message of humility, I think that a lot of people are maybe missing that message.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was a person who lived in a time where his people were slaves to an oppressive government. Right.
Yes. And he was also, I would say, very radical. Like, lived a radical life in a way that I think, and one reason, I think he lived in such a radical way that I really think that if Jesus was on the corner, I think so many people would be so dismissive of him.
Well, I mean, there's got to be. I mean, people were dismissive of him at the time, right? And I mean, but there has to be people out there who are thinkers, who want to make a difference, who want to create something new, who want a world that's better for everyone.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And there's going to be people like him, like Buddha, like Nietzsche, like whoever, right? Like Gandhi, that are going to create new ideas out of this life that we were, I guess, perhaps destined, perhaps just thrown at us.
Right. And I think, Nietzsche has this quote, and this might be like a nice place to like kind of wrap it all up. But Nietzsche,
we're in an hour. So.
Yeah, nice. But Nietzsche has this quote of man, but I would extrapolate to say human, so it's all inclusive. But humans are stretched on a tightrope between ape and Ubermensch, right? Which is this idea of like what humans look like beyond humans. This idea like the Ubermensch, the overman, the superman, right? Where Nietzsche offers this outlook of like what humans could one day become, right? And it's not like they are at present, right? And this goes back to kind of like where we started the podcast of the world doesn't have to be exactly as it is, and we don't have to be exactly who it is we think we have to be, but rather like we can keep moving towards this, like I would almost say kind of like ideal-ish kind of like creator of our own values, of self-mastery, of again like real ultimate possession of self, which is what I interpret to be reflective of like the Ubermensch, right? And maybe we have all these like teachers historically and at present, religiously, non-religiously, that offer us kind of this movement of and on this tightrope, right? And the fact that like we're not ape, we're not animal anymore, right? But we're also not what it is we could become yet, but we're kind of somewhere, we're stretched on this tightrope, which I always think is kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. And I mean, and I think that the metaphysical question is like, will we ever get there, right? But that's also part of, I think, the quote is to say, well, maybe we should try, right? Maybe we should try.
Well, there you have it, folks. It's Bryce Blankenship on living and dying and choosing between apehood and superhumanhood.
There it is. Cool. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on. And thank you for listening.